I would love to go around the room for you to introduce yourself as well as the organization and or department you are representing. And I will start to my far right on the back, please.
Jeremy Mills, Office of Constituent Services.
Roberta Witness, and Real Estate.
Warren Wooten, Housing and Neighborhood Services.
Stanley Martin,
Laura Belcher, Habitat Charlotte.
Paul Ballman, Crossland Southeast.
John Butler, Crossland Southeast.
Zelda Goodman, Housing Services and Legal Services.
Hannah Brownberger, Strategy and Budget.
Anna Schloinis, City Attorney's Office.
Jasmine Little, City Attorney's Office.
Miles Kahn, Housing and Neighborhood Services.
Elsie Garfield, West Side Community Land Trust Fund. Angie Ford, One Bank Housing Committee.
Connie Stodinger, Charlotte Housing Authority.
Kathy Gogger, the Men's Shelter of Charlotte.
Keith Richardson, Housing and Neighborhood Services.
And our job.
Donetta Collier, Self-Help Community Development Corporation.
I'm Guy Gately with Crossroads Corporation.
I'm Kathleen Bambrick Meyer, Crossroads Corporation.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mary Bird for Housing and Neighborhood Services.
Rebecca Pfeiffer, Housing and Neighborhood Services.
And I'm Tony Boston. I am at Goodwill Industries, but I'm here for myself as well.
Larry Broom with South Sherman.
I'm Deronda Metz with the Salvation Army Homeless Shelter.
Rhonda Simpson with Helping Hands, Affordable Housing.
Bowling McClung, Planning Commission.
And two young people just joined us. Your name and any organization you're representing.
Hi, I'm Kimberly Broughton from Gensler.
Hi, I'm Eugene, and I'm also from Gensler.
Thank you.
Gail Whitcomb, Housing and Neighborhood Services.
Matt Newton, Committee Member, District 5.
Justin Harlow, Committee Member.
LaWanna Mayfield, Committee Chair.
Ed Driggs, committee member.
Larkin Eggleston, committee member.
Deborah Campbell, City Manager's Office.
Pam Whiteman, Housing and Neighborhood Services.
Thank you all very much, and we have a pretty packed conversation ahead of us. So, Ms. Campbell, I'm turning it directly over to you.
And I will turn it directly over to Pam Whiteman.
Yay!
Well done, Deborah.
Teamwork.
Good afternoon, everybody. We have a couple of items to go with you, go through with you today. Funding requests, two different sets of funding requests, and then we have our housing, strategic housing framework. I'll start with the Emergency Solutions grant, if that's okay, since that's up there. I'll start with that one and just run through this really quickly. I would acknowledge that we do have our partners in the room, specifically the Salvation Army Women's Shelter, the Men's Shelter, and I'm not sure if we have anyone here from the relatives, but I'll go through these pretty quickly. Please stop me if you have questions. So Emergency Solutions funding is one of your 4 federal sources of funding that you get every year. So you get CDBG, you get HOME, you get HOPWA, and you get Emergency Solutions grant funding every year. This is the only federal funding that's available to support our emergency shelters in this community. And so when we think about housing, we think about a continuum of housing, right? And so we don't want to forget about our shelters. On any given night, the Salvation Army Women's Shelter, they house about 400 women, and the Men's Shelter, they have housed about 350 men on any given night. I won't read this to you, but basically there are 5 components to Emergency Solutions. It's street outreach. That's really important. That's the way that we connect with homeless folks that we see on the street. There often has to be a lot of relationship building before you can get someone in a shelter. The emergency shelter, obviously that is providing the shelter, and within that they can get some case management, which many cases assist with life skills, education, and other assistance that may be needed. Rapid rehousing, we don't want to just keep people in the shelters, we want to give them place to house, so that's the term rapidly rehoused. And then there's data collection. We want to make sure that we can monitor kind of who's coming through our shelters. And so you'll see funding requests for actually the emergency shelter space, the rehousing, and the data collection. This is just an illustration to show you how the funding from the federal government has fluctuated over the years. I'll point out to you in 2018, we received a spike in funding. We did not receive that same spike this year. We're not projected to receive that. We get proposals. We review them kind of the same way we do trust fund and other dollars, and then we bring them to the committee and then on to full council. You can see some of the criteria. We want to look at service alignment, we want to look at the experience of the agency, and then we want to look at the financial strength, meaning that we look at the agency program budget as well, and how they leverage city dollars as well. So three requests before you today. We have the Salvation Army Women's Shelter. They are requesting a total of $108,200. They want, with this money, they propose to provide emergency shelter to about 2,000 individuals. They propose to rapidly rehouse about 12 individuals. Those individuals are more than likely folks who are already in the shelter, but they have jobs and they're ready to help with housing expenses. And so these expenses will be used to help with this. This funding will be used to help with that. And that's one of the misnomers that I often point out. Many people think if you're in the shelter, you don't have a job. People often have a job. They just don't have a job to afford the rents. And so that's what they propose to do. And then they want to, they have to continue to collect the data to go with the homeless management information system. So that's Spratt, the women's shelter on Spratt Street. The men's shelter, kind of a similar thing. They are proposing to serve about 1,300 men with these dollars, and they're proposing to rapidly rehouse up to 11 people, up to 11 people, and then also data collection as well.
So, did y'all have a question for Ms. Wyden?
No, I was just clarifying something.
Okay, so all federal dollars to be used in this specific way. And then the relatives, this is a new partner. They're coming in now. Basically, right on time. Basically, their money will be, they're on East Boulevard, and they're unique in that they provide services to children in youth, right? And their goal is to ultimately get the folks back in contact with their family, but that they've been in this community for a long time. They offer a 24 crisis hotline, and the funding that they're requesting will be used for building improvements. Again, another shelter. I also wanted to show you all, those are the ones that require council's approval. They're over 100,000, but I also wanted to just show you how your money is working also in the community. These are some other partners that will be receiving funding as well: Community Link, Friendship CDC, Safe Alliance, and Supportive Housing Community. And you can see Community Link, they're going to prevent it, and so try to prevent homelessness, and so that's really important. Friendship, they're going to do some emergency shelter and data collection. Safe Alliance, it's emergency shelter, and then Supportive Housing Communities as well. So that is just a history that shows you an illustration of how we partnered with these organizations in the past to provide funding. And again, I'll point out the relatives is a new partner. So with that, our next step, if you all approve, we would move forward with a dinner presentation at your June 25th, I can't get these dates right, June 25th meeting, and then we've asked for your approval on July 23rd. So I'll stop there and see what questions you all might have.
Mr. Jordan?
Salvation Army, the $108,000 is obviously way down from prior year because of the extra funding we got, but it's also down from 2017. So is that a function just of the needs that they have communicated to us, or how does that comparison work?
Yeah, it's a little bit, it's a combination of things, Mr. Driggs. So they are still working through spending some of the money that we awarded them on that one-time basis last year. And so we're trying to balance out this because HUD wants us to spend this money kind of expeditiously, so we don't want that money sitting around. And then I believe there was a little bit of a cut as well to try to get in a new partner relatives, the relatives as well.
Yes, sir.
The relatives, they're a new beneficiary of these funds. I assume they do have a history in operating a track record, or is it a new organization?
No, relatives, they've
been around for a long time, right?
Yeah.
So, Madam Chair, I'd like to recommend that we approve this and recommend it to full council.
Second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any other discussion? Any opposed? There you have it.
Now keep it moving unless you guys tell me otherwise. So
It's federal dollars and it's a good
So I'll go on with the Community Housing Development Organizations.
Right.
We're out of chairs. There's somebody can have it. Everybody, okay? All right.
I am so happy to see so many people here today to join us for the housing discussion, so thank you. We will get more chairs if we need to, though.
Here's one here that somebody can have. All right, I think we're all in place.
Okay.
All right, so now we're going to look at our Certified Housing Development Organization funding request. So you all know this. I don't have to repeat this slide to you, kind of who needs affordable housing. I'll go right to what a CHODO is. It's a private, nonprofit, community-based organization, has paid staff. They develop affordable housing in communities that need it. They provide programming and services. They engage the community. They must meet the legal criteria around what a CHODO is, and pretty much it's a nonprofit. It's that first bullet. They have to have a board of directors, that kind of thing. And they must be physically sound, and what that means, and the capacity. We want to put this money in the hands of organizations who have the ability and the capacity to develop. So we have 5 CHODOs, 5 certified CHODOs in this community. Belmont CDC, Crossroads, they are in the room today. Don Gately, I'll take a point of privilege, he is retired, he's served Crossroads for many years, so congratulations, Don, on your retirement. They've done a lot of work in the Greer Heights community. We have the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Housing Partnership, we have the Friendship CDC, and the Mosaic Development Group. They're CHODOs. As a part of our home funding, the federal government requires us to do a 15% set aside to organizations like this. So that's the way the federal government helps organizations like this, community organizations. And so that's all that slide says. And they have to serve households earning 80% and below. So you can see what our allocation is. So our available balance is $651,295. We meet with our CHODOs on a regular basis. We always encourage them to bring requests for it because we don't want this money sitting around. If we don't use it, HUD will be obligated, and we have too many needs in this community to have it be obligated. We have 2 proposals in front of you today. The first one is Crossroads, from Crossroads CDC. They're in the Greer Heights community. That's they call it Elizabeth Heights. I don't know if you guys have been over there. Mr. Evanston, in your district, I'm sure you're familiar with it. They propose to construct 8 units, and their request is $500,000. You can see what the leverage is, 1 to 4, a 15-year affordability period. If you haven't seen these homes, I would encourage you to see them. They're really well done. Druid Hills, they propose to do 3 units. Their request is $150,000. The affordability period is the same. You can see what that leverage ratio is. I'll point out Druid Hills, that is right across from Bright Walk, right behind St. Luke Church. And so the community has been talking a lot about kind of gentrification. And so this provides home ownership opportunity in a neighborhood where neighbors are worried about gentrification because of everything that's going on around them. So those are the only 2 requests we have today. These will follow the same process. They will be on your June 25th for a dinner briefing, and then we bring both of these requests to you in July at your July meeting for approval by the City Council.
Ms. Wyman, how often are total dollars allocated?
We do it at least annually.
Because if we go back to our numbers, we see that we have $651,000 that's available. This request is for 650 of that, leaving 1295. So we're in June. We only get CHODO requests once a year?
Pretty much, yes. We only because we know for the 15%, this is
Right.
our home. Yeah. This is not to say this is the only home ownership that you are doing, right?
I'm only asking
Okay.
specifically for CHODO.
Yes,
If
ma'am.
we allocate this.
Yes, ma'am.
There's 650 requests for 2 projects.
Yeah.
Does that potentially create any challenges within the next fiscal year?
No, ma'am, because we still have other funds.
Mr. Eggleston? And then Dr. Hollow.
I don't mean to burst my colleague, Dr. Harlow's
We'll take it in
bubble,
District 2.
but that's District 1.
Oh,
I knew he was going to say
oh, okay, you guys share
the
that.
Druid Hills, yeah.
Not that we're
that part of
territorial, not that
Druid
we're territorial with each other, but
I knew he was going to say. I have a real question.
Yes, sir.
So, as it relates to the 15% set aside, that's every year from a home allocation. So is the prior year balance the reason we didn't spend those dollars? And is that from the set aside or is that just the total homes bucket?
That's from the set aside. And basically what we do, Mr. Harlow, is we encourage, we meet with them, like I said, quarterly, and we encourage people to bring projects forward. It's not always that people will bring these organizations, right? It has to be spent with these organizations, that they will bring projects forward.
So what happens if we don't? I mean, we're clearly using it up here, but I'm just, as a theoretical question.
If we didn't,
Yeah.
HUD would be obligated the money. I mean, we'd be in trouble with HUD, right? So we'd lose the money back to HUD, and we don't want to do that.
Yeah, no, okay, I'm just curious.
Oh, we're spending the money. We're not getting the money back. So with that,
Approval of full council?
second.
moved and properly seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Mr. Newton, did you have any questions for discussion? Okay, any opposed? Ayes have it. On to our conversation. Ms. White.
So I'll just take just a few minutes to have some introductory words. You will see on your agenda that we are asking for action to forward this Housing Charlotte framework onto full council. We are anticipating that on July 23rd will be the action by full council. We have had a number of opportunities to discuss the content. We also sent out a couple of emails reminding you all to get us comments back.
And
if you had questions or needed additional information, clarification.
I do have questions, and I want to apologize. And I don't want to interrupt too prematurely, but I just want to say that I do have some questions.
So,
and I'll turn it over to Pam just shortly.
Right, because after Ms. Campbell finishes, we want to have a couple minutes to be able to have conversation.
Comments. We have been asked, why doesn't this framework have really specific information about how you're going to use $50 million? That wasn't necessarily the intent of this. This was really to give us a citywide perspective particularly from elected officials with regards to your priorities, a context for how, when money is available, how you would use it. It wasn't ever intended to specifically prescribe how to use it. And so with that, we hope that you will entertain the spirit in which this document was developed, that we are focusing on using housing as an investment in neighborhoods. It's just not about housing units. We cannot say that enough. And it's also about strategically locating those units in areas where it is most needed and where it can revitalize and uplift neighborhoods and people. And so with that, Pam, is there any additional?
So the piece that I would add to that is that it should be a living, breathing document. So for a committee, while Mr. Newton pulls his thoughts together, I want us to definitely keep in mind that this is for staff to really get in over the summer and come back. But this gives us the ability, if it comes out of committee, to move it to full council to say, yes, this is the framework, this is the right direction, and then give them the opportunity to do the work behind it. Mr. Newton, you had a couple of questions?
Yeah, I did. So I wanted to apologize, Deborah and Pam, for not getting questions to you sooner. I'm hoping that these could be fielded prior, well, at this point, any suggested maybe tweaks could occur before the presentation to council as a whole and final decision from the council as a whole. But I kind of honed in on the summary of key strategies that started on page 26. And I assume that's kind of going to be that framework that we're talking about, that we want to implement the living, breathing portion of this policy. And I love the emphasis. So I just wanted to say that expanding home ownership opportunities, the emphasis on the preservation of existing affordable housing. But it probably comes as no surprise, but I wanted to ask a little bit about in Objective 1A, expanding the supply of high-quality rental and owner-occupied housing, how with Strategy 1, increasing rental production, how the locational policy, if that's incorporated in this, how so, what are we talking about from a locational standpoint?
Great question, Mr. Newton. And so when you hear Ms. Mayfield and Ms. Campbell and others talk about work over the summer, we have still to bring you back a revised locational policy, right? And so we're working on that. And so you will still have a locational policy to consider when you are approving deals. So it is incorporated in that.
Gotcha. So I didn't see that included in that particular column. I feel comfortable if it, more comfortable, I think, if it were. So just wanted to bring that to your attention. And what I did realize, and so this is a point that Councilmember Harlow and I talked about earlier, and he brought to my attention was the idea of us leveraging land.
That's right.
Which means, right, we're going to actively pursue the purchase of some land for potential diverse price point housing development. Now, I wanted to ask about, because when I flipped through, and I think it was on page, there was more information pertaining that on page 35, which actually appears to be a locational map, which I'm assuming, when I read page 34, a little bit more pertaining to the acquisition fund, is kind of our target locational map. I want to ask about that because what I see is I see it really honing in on transit and in some regard we're talking about transit that has yet to be funds have yet to be approved for. We might not even see any funds approved for maybe 30 years down the road. Might not see shovel and ground, right? 30, 40 years down the road.
So let me step back, Mr. Newton, and then let me respond to that also. So I want to step back and say, what you see, summary of key strategies, these are tools, right? These are best practice tools that can be used to advance affordable housing. Some we're using, some we're not using, right? A locational policy is not a tool. The locational policy really talks about how you direct your resources to build. So keep that in mind. As to your question about, we point to transit stations, some we have funding for, some we don't. What we've learned, and we want to be smarter about, is we know that it is cheaper to make those investments along proposed transit stops much sooner. It's cheaper to do it if you do it before the transit gets going. And so that's why we want to be strategic there. It's not saying that we're going to go immediately there, but again, if we're looking at targeting our resources, this gives us some guide to where we ought to target to utilize our resources to get folks close to transit opportunities, either now or proposed.
Assuming, right? I mean, assuming that occurs, because I've heard a lot of talk. I think it's phase 3 of the Gold Line, whether or not that's going to happen.
Right.
Right. And so I harbor some concerns there pertaining to kind of this map and the assumption.
Sure.
I don't want to say this too. I hope it does. So it's not like I'm saying I don't hope that doesn't happen.
Let me also add with staff what the realities that we saw. We had an opportunity, previous councils many years ago, before the original light rail was identified. We had a number of opportunities in South End to identify and have a focus on making sure we had diverse housing options, and we missed that opportunity. So moving forward, even if there's opportunity to acquire the land at a much more economical rate, it's better to have the language in place now than to try to play catch up, because there's no way we can really go buy land in South End right now.
What do you think, and so let me propose this, because do you think this is not limiting? If we're just talking, and maybe you can explain some of this too then, and clarify it for me, Pam, because it seems like we're kind of really honing in on just transit lines, rather than maybe the broader conversation of potential amenities available to residents, jobs, nutrition, schools.
And you saw the next map, right?
So let me
the next map goes into, because remember, this isn't, this leaving brief.
Why the two maps?
Because you asked two different. No, and this is for those who are also, the maps are available. The whole information is going to be sent out eventually, but we have goals, we have targets currently. So some of these questions that you're asking are in there, but remember, this form, this isn't, here is everything. We just identified that this, if it comes out of committee, and I'm hoping that we all recognize that this is a great outline, that in the summer is where the devil is going to get into the details. Not here, not today.
And if I could, Madam Chairman, the maps differentiate in terms of opportunities. Where are areas of opportunity? First map, is building access to opportunity areas, vulnerable areas, and areas in close proximity to public transit. The other map is expanding access to opportunity in areas in close proximity to public transit. But the actual information that is included gives you a distinction between those areas where...
But when would one map be used and not the other? Because wouldn't it just be a
You are going to
wash?
use...
Right? I mean, it's basically all of Charlotte's.
So let me see if I can help.
No. Go ahead.
Yes.
So, for example, the map on page 35, if you look at the green and the yellow, basically what those two areas is pointing out to you, access to jobs, the green areas and the yellow areas.
Pam, I remember when he doesn't have a color map, he just has a black and white map. So,
We'll take mine.
did we bring the power? We didn't bring the
No, I
PowerPoint this
didn't.
week?
Yeah.
I'll give you mine.
So basically, one map is saying if you build in these areas, you are building in close proximity to jobs, goods, and services, right? So that's 35. That's a choice that you guys can make. That's where you can target your resources if you choose to. And don't take building literally, Mr. Newton. You can preserve in those areas, right, as well.
Well, yeah, absolutely.
So don't take building literally. Your next map is saying, so we talk about access to opportunity, social capital, schools, all that kind of thing. It's just pointing out the blue and the fuchsia. It's saying these areas, they rank higher in school quality, access to jobs, social capital. Again, it's just pointing out opportunities in the city where you all can choose to target your investments. Like I said, we have to bring you back a locational policy, so we could write language in the locational policy that speaks to
So is
that.
this just, so is what you're saying, this is just informational?
Yes, sir,
Yeah,
this is a
it-
framework.
Okay, so
Areas of opportunity.
there is no policy tied to this right now?
No,
In any of the
absolutely
decision-making that we're making?
If you look at the crosshatch areas, it says these areas are vulnerable to displacement. And so it's information for us to say, okay, something is happening that we don't want to happen, which is displacement.
I've got that. I mean, I'm not disputing any of that. I'm just
Sure.
wondering how this ties into what we're going to be voting on here in a moment, particularly from the standpoint, I mean, it's attached to the acquisition fund. So is this going to be guiding, that policy of acquisition, or is it,
No, sir.
you're just saying it's simply information?
She has to develop a acquisition fund policy.
Yeah, this is, and the acquisition fund, it might not be your dollars, it might be private dollars, right? But what this does is say that you guys embrace the tools, right? These are, like I said, these are the key strategies, which are tools. These are best practice strategies that are used across the country to expand, preserve, further affordable housing. That's all it says. You all will still vote on every project. You will have policies to direct your resources. This is just a framework that will guide you over the next 10 years or so.
Mr. Everson, Dr. Hollow.
From just a technical perspective, I want to understand, what we're voting on today is kind of this in principle, but what is presented to council on July 23rd will be a slightly tweaked and modified version of this as we give input over that time.
Oh, we were supposed to do that last week.
Right.
Well, no, I know,
that's the last
and I've
meeting.
been talking to them about it, but what has been said a couple of times is that this is a living, breathing document, and so to presume that nothing's going to change between now and July 23rd would mean this is not a living, breathing document. So I'm trying to figure out if we're literally, if this will
We hope that
literally...
it lives more than a month.
Right.
always
The
try.
ultimate goal is from this committee today, is for us to identify it, since we've had a week or so to review it and have hopefully had the opportunity to ask questions. The goal is to say this framework that we've identified, are we comfortable moving this to full council? It will be over the summer months that staff was going to really get in and get down to all of the direct specifics, but this overview of what our plan is. And it's what I had said the last meeting is I'm more concerned about making sure that we have a plan for the dollars that we allocated. So we passed the budget. We know we're going to the community for $50 million. we're hoping that the partner community is also going to bring 50 million, that's 100 million. We don't have any control over that, but we can put language in place to let it be known that here is our goals and our expectations, so when you come to the table, the development community has a better idea of what it is the council has said is a priority.
So maybe I need to reframe my question. First, I have two comments on it, and I have had a chance to talk to Pam some about it. And my technical question is, if there is any, obviously not a period or a comma missing or something, but if there is any material or statistical change that is made in here, either be due to error or due to guidance that's given between now and July 23rd, would that negate what we are now putting forward and need to say, well, that has to go back to committee because committee approved? Right, so the document can be changed and modified and corrected or improved between now and July 23rd. We're kind of approving it in principle, not literally it's going to be.
If there's a typo in there or something.
Yes, sir.
I'll just move beyond that question then.
So, Mr. Everson, on that question, I believe my colleague really wants to share a thought. Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In general, I would like to clarify my understanding of this, which is it basically pulls together all the conversations we've had. It takes the tools that existed and ones that are contemplated and enumerates them, and thereby creates a basis for a much more tangible conversation than we've had so far. It's the first step in a process which, going forward, will include looking at our location policy, will include conversations with private funding partners, potential private funding partners. I think this document is actually helpful in those conversations because we need to kind of go to them and be able to say, this is our idea, you know, where do you see yourselves? And how do we kind of move them along in terms of the commitments we want from them? As far as changing this, if this committee approves this document, I'm a little uneasy about changes other than edits or whatever. I think the opportunity for anybody to make a policy comment about this was during the past week. And frankly, if it does get changed, it's like a referral back to the zoning committee and a zoning process. If there are significant changes, then this committee is no longer deemed to have approved it. So I'm hoping that today we can recommend to the full council, explain our terms, because those terms need to be clearly understood. One of my concerns about this was that there are a lot of questions in here that aren't answered.
Okay,
how many
so
units are we going to create?
Mr. Everson wasn't finished. I was letting you jump in specifically on
But I
one
had my
piece
hand
of
up for a
right.
while.
But I still have the floor.
You're along with everybody else. So,
Thank you.
Part two.
And I don't.
I am trying to respond to your point.
No, and you did, and I don't have a problem with that being what we're saying. I wanted to make sure it was clear what we were saying, which is if there are material changes, this would be referred back to committee. And so I wasn't saying that was good or bad. I was clarifying that that's what we're doing, because some of the language that had been used in talking about it made it sound like this was going to be ever evolving. If it is ever evolving between now and July 23rd, the committee might have to reconsider it. I too like the fact that we've got this out there and we're demonstrating more of a plan and more of a path forward with the dollars that we're asking the community to support. One thing, and this will not surprise Ms. Watson because she and I have already talked about it, but I'll say it for the sake of the group, is, and I flipped through here twice and I couldn't find the page number, but I do think that we need to be more explicit about the fact that some of what we're talking about in here is under the assumption that the private sector comes to the table with $50 million in matching funds, because some of these numbers are reflective of that, and I don't think that's crystal clear in here. And also I think, and you and I discussed this yesterday, I think that the 41-40-19 split on our strategies was, and I contributed to this, so I'm not putting this on anybody but us as a whole, I think come to kind of haphazardly in a quick, in a completely unscientific way during our retreat. And again, I contributed to that. I think we said, well, like, you know, maybe 40-40-20. And then we said, well, we want to be a little bit more on the side of preservation. So let's call it 41 and 40 and 19. There's, when I was asked to defend those percentages this week, there was no scientific basis for them. So I think for us to put it in a plan, I think we can either more loosely say, we think that creation and preservation will be similar, equal parts of our strategy though, given the, all things being equal, we would err towards preservation or err towards creation, then we also think the or whatever we call it, self-sufficiency is kind of the third piece of the pie there in a slightly less significant role.
Sure.
Whatever that is, but I think if we're going to prescribe hard numbers to something, we need to be able to scientifically defend them, or it's not a strategy, it's just...
And that's one of the things that the co-chair and I, vice chair and I have already spoken to staff regarding, is the numbers and the percentages, and Ms. Campbell's going to speak to that.
Ms. Whiteman and I had a long conversation about this, and I hope that you all will notice the terms that are used to describe this chart. On page 21, it says how HTF has supported Charlotte residents. That's passed, and we divided it up into 60, 15, 25. And then it says how HTF could support Charlotte residents. So it's a could. It's not a will, it's not a shall, it is how it could. So I think that leaves us a lot of flexibility. All we're showing is that there's really probably more of a commitment now, and based on being able to value preservation equally, or to some level, some higher level as new construction.
Because we also recognize there have been communal changes during the time that we have started this conversation. So you got to have the time to look at what are today's realities and looking at the projections of what we're trying to do moving forward. Ms. Whiteman, did you want to comment? Because I still have Dr. Hollow, Mr. Driggs, and also Mr. Neal.
I was just going to support Ms. Campbell in terms of, we know also that naturally occurring affordable house is the largest stock, right? And so we've got to preserve that. We won't build our way out of it, so.
And track it, and track any loss.
Dr. Hollow?
So I've read this multiple times, and Gail, thanks for continuously sending it out and keeping it fresh on our minds. I like this as a framework. To me, I see this as just, it's a tip of the iceberg. We've got a lot of conversations to be had about future real things as it relates to dollars and cents, because we don't even know what that looks like yet. But I think, setting that table for whoever outside of this building wants to say, hey, I want to participate with you guys, I think that this is important. We've outlined priorities. We've outlined what our current tools in the toolbox are. We've outlined, because of many conversations in this room and at our retreat, what some new tools could be, and what some objectives look like around those tools. I think this is very comprehensive. I'm not so sold on having to say we have to have specific numbers in this document. I think in some future, definitive policy plans that the whole council, I'm certain, will weigh in on, will have all of those, deeper dive specifics. This here, this captures all the conversations we've had over 6 months, and so, I'm very supportive of it. I think we've got a great new focus on preservation and anti-displacement. I think in future conferences, I know I will make more comments around, that, let's get a little bit bolder on some of the lower income strata, but I've made that clear in the hand retreat before. But outside of, just having a framework and say, hey, here, look, we painted the picture. So folks who might want to bring some outside dollars in aren't just totally clueless on what we're going to do. This may make or break it for them, and that's fine. And then for those that make it a step further, we have something more concrete, a concrete plan, comprehensive plan later, which I think the voters want to eventually hear too, because we're asking for their support down the road here. So I like it. Great job, staff. I know we're kind of bouncing around a little bit here, but and other folks got to comment. This is comprehensive. This captures so much for us of what we've all talked about. I feel like some of the questions are coming up here are things we've either already addressed or are kind of so minute that you're going to get another opportunity when full council vets this.
Mr. Driggs.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, as I was saying before, I think it's essential that we move with this, understanding what it is, it's what it does and what it doesn't do. What I'm hoping for also, though, is then as we go beyond this, a kind of a timeline and action steps, right? So that we don't kind of do this and feel like we've finished it. All right? So, in particular, we need to establish what private funding is available. we're going to have to, on some questions, we're going to have to talk to the legislature because there are a couple of things that are contemplated in here. And frankly, the sooner we do that before this document circulates and they recognize that it does affect them, the better. We do need to clarify our position on things like the dispersion, the price points we want to access, and so on. So, as I say, this is a jumping off point and a good one, and I just hope that we can continue to hear from you about when those other things will occur, recognizing that in November, when the voters want to know what are we doing with their $50 million, we've got to have a good answer for them.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Mr. Newton, Mr. Winston.
Yeah, so I just, would ask that as we, receive this back on the, on the floor of the entire council, that some of that confusion for me be tied up pertaining to these maps, and if they're informational right now, maybe drawing what's policy-based out of them and including that for us. So it doesn't seem, in having two maps that basically encompass all of Charlotte seems like an opportunity for some cherry picking here rather than real policy. So I would ask that that be some of that confusion that exists for me at least be clarified within the documentation.
Sure, yes, sir. That's it. Mr. Winston.
Just going back to the discussion about the scientific versus unscientific kind of data that goes into making the graphs on page 21, I would ask staff if this has been done, and if not, I'll make a suggestion that we should do an audit of the life of the Housing Trust Fund in terms of over the past 30 years, where has that money gone, into what type of projects.
That's what the diagram on the left. That's what the income.
Well, in terms of income, but then kind of taking a step further, how have these projects aged in terms of not just when the money was given out, how have they remained in terms of have they become less affordable or more affordable, and then I think that kind of information might be able to guide us and guide the public to say, well, where is this money going? How is it most effective dollar for dollar when we invested in certain areas? Where have we failed and where have we succeeded in making these investments from this fund? To make some larger correlations and not just kind of the percentage at the beginning of the doling out process.
So, Mr. Winston, I'll take a stab at that now, and I can do this again at the full council and talk to you some more about it. But, so one thing to know is that the Housing Trust Fund has been in existence since 2001, right? So it's a fairly young program. So it's 2001 is kind of when we started making the first grants.
It says the Housing Trust Fund has enabled the city to realize more affordable housing, safeguard the affordability of many of its investments for at least 30 years.
Safeguarding for 30 years.
Oh, safeguarding.
So when we make an investment, there's a 30-year affordability period on that, right? They are inspected every year. And so, and they are financed in such a way, unlike old school public housing, that they are upgraded not upgraded, but that they are monitored every year, and that they are performing in such a way so that when carpets need to be changed, paint needs, they can live well in the community over the years. But I can give you more of a breakdown, if you like, on kind of where they are and how they're doing.
Ms. Wyman, I think what would also be helpful is another part to my colleague's question. If we look at the projects where we've had a 30-year commitment versus the last few years or so, even today, we're seeing a number of projects that are coming in with only a 15-year commitment. That is a different question as far as what are we seeing as far as trends across the nation and or impact when historically dollars from government were used with that 30-year commitment and now we're seeing more that are coming in still at relatively the same dollar amount request and or higher because of cost and demand, but we're looking at a 15-year commitment, which is not nearly as long versus a 30. So that might be something that would be helpful to break down either, and that one I think can come when in the summer, when as you're really capturing these numbers, but so that the community and the committee know that we're really looking at what is that real impact as we're making these investments.
And so, Ms. Mayfield, I'll remind you, on all trust fund, right, the state puts a 15-year affordability period. Because you use your local trust fund dollars, you put another 15-year. And in some cases, remember, you've got 40 years. For these projects that you just approved, these are federal dollars. And so they have limits about how long the affordability period is. And also remember, you're creating home ownership too.
Right, so that's why I asked for that breakout, because with having new members and some of us that have been around for a while but haven't been at the beginning of the conversation, it would be helpful to break that down so that we can have easier conversations with the community versus federal dollars and the commitment. And when the state has this 15, when we say 15, it's really 30, giving some actual numbers. Mr. Winston, you had a follow-up?
So the other idea, kind of bridging the gap a little bit, and to speak to that unscientific data that we're just asking some of our constituents just to trust, to see how the effect of these investments have affected the area kind of around it, because that's what we ran into when we approved the 4% deal for Hidden Valley. I think it was the Crossland community. They were like, well, we don't want this because it's going to drag down. It's going to drag. But we're saying, well, this is going to be a $30 million investment in your community. That should only lift it, but I don't really have any data to say that that is true. I don't know if it, in the long run, it's making displacement more of a possibility around that area as well. You know?
No, I totally get your point, Mr. Winston. And again, we'll do this analysis for you. But one I'll point to that's most visible is if you look at Bright Walk, right? And I think did we go by that? We went there, all right? And so Bright Walk started with the affordable, right? That signaled to the community and to that business quarter, you know how it changed, that somebody cared. So the affordable actually lifted that. And so now you have all of the
I agree.
The new, so we can
first word
our choice. And actually, the park in Oaklawn kind of catalyzed that, which is all affordable. That has been there for about 10, 15 years or more, maybe even 20.
And I'm an anecdotal person too, and that works for me. I just feel like data is necessary for the larger, and it connects faster.
We can look at tax value when we started and kind of what tax value is now.
And the Urban Land Institute has done a lot of analysis about the how the impact that affordable housing has, so we can start using some information on that.
Thank you.
Mr. Driggs?
Thank you. I wanted to comment briefly. You may be able to address the maps question by just suggesting that they are there for context and don't reflect any decisions that have been made. My question was, aren't there instances where the deed restriction expires on some properties and they actually remain affordable based on who the developer was or who the owner is? They don't automatically flip to market price housing.
No, sir.
So as we assess the kind of performance of these investments, knowing a little more about when we've actually created something even longer lasting than a deed restriction would be interesting.
Great point. Thank you.
Dr. Hollow?
So this is a little more in response to Mr. Winston's point. And while I support in spirit what you're trying to get at from a data level standpoint, I'm a little confused on what more we're asking for, because I feel, we got 50 pages here, 10 of them are all graphs and tables talking about change in median rent and income based on the years, rates of housing insecurity in the city, the supply. We finally are starting getting closer to an idea of the net loss that we're having around, or net gain or loss that we're having as it relates to NOAA stuff, and how that ties to our population growth, the amounts of large scale. We've got a lot of data in this. So are you looking for like street level view?
Can you answer the question of what is the impact of spending for every dollar spent out of housing trust fund on 9% deals? What is that impact on the community? Dollar for dollar, like what is?
It changes based on the community. There's no set number on that.
Well, the community is going to ask us when we spend this money, what should we expect?
And they should, and that's what we're getting to, is what you can expect, but it's not gonna be zeroed in on a number. Because the expectations are going to differ. There's no way anyone in the community would have expected that what was once Westwood Apartments will be sold, and I would literally have $447,000 unit right next door to a $50,000 unit. But when we did some investments along West Moorhead and the Cross Charlotte Trail, because all of it ties in, the Cross Charlotte Trail and that connectivity and the investments and the road widenings and the realignments that happened in the area helped trigger a lot of this growth.
Again, I understand this. What I'm being asked from the community is that we've had this fund, and it seems like we're always voting yes on it. We're always voting yes on it. And we're spending this money. But we're not able, we as a community is not able to see. We don't know what we're getting out of it. And they want to know for every $15 million that's spent, how many units are we getting? How is that being secured over time? And what does this mean? Again, this is why I say data point by data. We're giving very anecdotal examples
Ms. Campbell
right
actually
now.
is
something that we can.
So definitely we can provide the historical perspective. Going forward with 50 million, we want to get with our partners, which could be LISC, it could be Charlotte American Housing Board, it could be a bunch of folks that we bring to the table and say, what are your plans? How should we be investing these resources in? I think this helps us provide a context, particularly for how public dollars and the priorities that the city has. Just one thing that I want to make note of is the underpinning of this whole framework, a framework for building and expanding access to opportunities through housing investments. Those maps really say there are certain kinds of opportunities in these geographies, and then there's certain opportunities in these other geographies. We need to make sure that we are investing in both of those geographies. And so the data that you need, we can provide that as kind of an opening when we present some of the information to say, here's our history with some of our funding. But I do believe that a lot of this detailed information is almost Chamber of Commerce marketing information that says, here's what we have done, here's what we have accomplished with previous resources. But I do know that you all have a need to have more specificity about, for example, if the voters approve $50 million, how might we spend these monies? And again, this gives you a framework for, here's our priorities in terms of geographies, in terms of preservation, expansion, family self-sufficiency. So I think that's the value of the document.
Sorry, I just want to make sure I'm answering you. Matt, answer the question. We know there was a news report last week. CIAA came in, it had the economic impact of $56 million or whatever it is. So the community knows the sacrifices that were made to make that happen, this is what we got back out of it. Sure. That type of information, what is the, first, how have the investments of these $15 million for every 2 years over the past 17, 18 years, how have we seen access to opportunity expanded in those areas? What has been the total economic impact to the community? And or the housing numbers, how has that exponentially increased access to homes? Things like that.
Yeah, I got it now. I was a little confused because some of the comments you're making, I was like, man, I can answer some of those. Yeah, we're looking for more detail, more about how have our dollars literally been leveraged in a way, more from an opportunity standpoint, not just from a rooftop standpoint.
Correct.
I got you. Okay, that's fair.
And we have access to that information because we've given updates over the years on it. But there is the conversation which staff already knows. Every couple of years, let's just probably get it into the rotation to start recapping.
It's an education. So the point well taken. We need to show the community. And I think of it as, what if we didn't? What if we hadn't done what we've done? Where would we be? So it's kind of like what are the benefits of affordable housing, right?
And for the residents that are living in
That's
the
right.
communities that are being built, what are the data points? So what are we talking about from the standpoint of, how we measure that? Is it, access, higher access to jobs, higher access, what would it be? You're kind of mentioning economic.
Okay, so what,
We're not there.
as we're
We'll get
moving
there. We'll have more
forward, again,
conversations.
this is where staff, and what I need, 2 minutes to 3 from the committee is the recommendation, which we have, the motion and a second. Gail, did you capture those at the beginning? Okay, so I need a motion and,
The draft framework.
Second.
motion and second.
Discussion. So yeah, from the standpoint
Okay,
of
now,
these, from the standpoint of these maps,
I don't think
No.
you recognize that.
again, so I have a motion and a second on it. You
yeah, so
have,
now we're moving into discussion.
right,
That's
as
the
I'm
way it
getting ready
works.
to move into discussion.
So from the standpoint of these maps,
I'm gonna
I
really
actually
need to
like,
respond to questions
like
ahead of time.
Councilmember Driggs's point here about just providing the fact that this is contextual in nature. It's something that I think for me provides or creates a lot of confusion, because basically we're saying everywhere, right? There are no priorities on what's important, what's not important. It's basically wherever you want to put it. You can cherry pick whichever map you want to cherry pick and select, but having said that, I think showing that it's purely contextual would be something that I would ask.
Sure.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Ayes have it. So another thing, if we send out information, it is going to be helpful for a committee, for us to take the responsibility and take the time to ask the questions of staff ahead of time, so that one, they can come prepared to share that information to the entire committee, opposed to trying to fill in questions, even though they have the answers to them. If there were a handout to go along with it, it would have been helpful for staff to be able to give that out to the whole committee. So as you, staff, continue to move forward, and we have these conversations and you bring back the details, and we have questions, and what I'm going to ask for the committee is that we take on the responsibility of actually reaching out ahead of time to ask the questions, or at least let others know that we're going to have additional, so that we can make sure that we allocate the appropriate time for it. And with that, motion to adjourn. Second. Thank you all so very much. You kept it to your hour.